So we've been looking a little bit at how qualitative research gets used and aggregated to tell sort of a story, but I'd like to spend just a bit of time talking about how we cite or present that qualitative data, because I think that there's some complexity and some nuance to that that intersects with what we've talked about with ethics, but has some more operational elements I'd like to kind of cover briefly. So if we were just interested in the mechanics of citations, we could look up the American Psychological Association's format for citing qualitative research, and it's basically, provide, a name of the interview or of the source, when it was done, describe it. Was it, personal communication, right? We had a chat, or was it an interview, or it was over the phone or email or text message, or however that conversation played out, just sort of let that, classify that. And that should be good enough. Maybe you would add a location if it was an interview and you were in person. Maybe that would be a relevant detail to add. But by and large, you're just providing an organized description of what it is that you're drawing on for qualitative research. So that's fairly straightforward and fairly simple. And in terms of, again, the mechanics of like, where do I put this in my works cited? There you go. That works. But we also should be thinking about that question of anonymity. And with more statistical research, survey research, anonymity is fairly easy to ensure because, one, we're working with oftentimes fairly rough kind of information, right? So, how do you feel about a particular topic, like, dislike, strongly, strongly like? That's hard to parse out an individual from. We're using large numbers of cases, and we're oftentimes able to report just sort of like a participant ID number rather than their name and identifying information. So typically with quantitative data, it's fairly easy to have anonymity, but with qualitative data, this is something that is trickier. And I should say that there's, like with much qualitative research, there's not necessarily a one right way to do this. Norms can vary by field, right? And so if you are in journalism is going to have very different sort of ideas around how you negotiate anonymity, right? Do you allow a source to be anonymous? Do you allow them to be cited as top level Department of Defense official? Do they have to have their name associated with information? And that can be a conversation that you can have. And it should be very clear, like, this is how I will be reporting this. But again, there's sort of with journalism, the idea that names oftentimes are attached to information. In academic research, that's less the case. In academic research, we oftentimes emphasize the idea of anonymity of our sources, that we don't sort of throw people out there to be sort of scrutinized as people. We're interested in sort of the larger conversation about human beings rather than this specific human being. Public officials maybe have a different you interact a little bit differently with, but by and large, I think academics begin with the idea that they should be protecting the anonymity of the people that they've been working with. But what that means can vary a lot, right? So we could be thinking about internal anonymity, right? Which is, I'm going to change, take out your identifying information, right? I'm going to replace it with a, in a quantitative context, a case ID number that's anonymous, right? That would, removing those identifying details around a source can help protect a source's identity, maybe, but maybe not. So maybe we also want to think about not just sort of the internal piece of how are we managing our data, but the external piece of how we present that data to the larger world. And we may want to calibrate the content of what we're actually sharing. Think seriously about what information goes out to make sure that people can't reverse engineer the identity of a source. And if you recall back to Humphrey's tea room trade study, that was one of the critical things that he did wrong, is he didn't sufficiently pay attention to how people could reverse engineer identity and thus expose people to broader scrutiny as individuals rather than just sort of a story about human behavior. I could also add maybe, I don't even know what to call this, procedural anonymity. And I'm just sort of reminded of a case that went really wrong at Boston College, where a couple researchers conducted thousands of hours of interviews with militants from the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and conducted those under the communicated instructions that these recordings, as part of an oral history project, would never see the light of day while these people lived. Like they would be embargoed, and they would never be handed over to the police. And that didn't happen. I think they were subpoenaed or they brought to light somehow as part of an investigation. And there was a real sense of betrayal, understandably, on the part of people who participated in this project because they had been promised a level of anonymity in a process and a procedure that the researchers just weren't in a position to be able to guarantee. And I think that's something else when we think about data storage and anonymity and how long stuff is sort of kept out of the public eye. We should be paying attention to what we can actually promise in terms of that. So just a third dimension of this problem to consider. And if we're thinking about internal anonymity, there's a couple things that we can do. And this can help with external as well. Pretty common to use pseudonyms in writing up academic research. Sometimes it's kind of created in an interview with person A, but you can also, if that person features prominently in your story, if it's a story about field work and you're interacting with them regularly, give them a different name. I've seen studies where they've it's been of a small town, I think in Vermont, and it was pretty clear, like as soon as you name the town, you could start drilling down, identifying like, who's the chief of police and who's on the school board. And so instead of, not just changing the names of those people, also changing the name of the town to give it a fictitious town in Vermont. And people could speculate, right? They could say, oh, well, it sounds kind of like this town or this town or this town, but you don't know for sure. And therefore you can't say, aha, this is the police chief or this is the school board member that was talked about in the study. So that could work, anonymize your locations as well. Sometimes people in writing up their results and they're from qualitative research will create a composite. They'll say, well, this person I'm describing isn't a real person, but I talked to 3, 4, 5 people and they all kind of fit together into this person. And so what the interview that I'm presenting is actually not just one person, but several, but that's okay, right? I mean, the underlying current of what was said is still accurate. I'm just presenting in a way where you can't parse out and say, well, this person versus that person. Okay. Or you could just sort of obscure kind of how you talk about your data collection process, right? So rather than saying here are the interviews, but they're composite, you could obscure how you describe your data collection, right? So over the course of 6 months, I was in this, this dozen locations conducting field work and interviews, right? Okay, so you potentially interacted with thousands of people or hundreds of people, and it would be difficult to maybe say conclusively, oh, that was from this one town. Well, it could have also been this other one over here. So we can also adjust how we report to create greater layers of obscurity around that. That having been said, I would always encourage people to think seriously about external anonymity and to think seriously about the level of risk. I'll say risk associated with that, because if your audience is just the general public, most people aren't going to spend a lot of time trying to drill down. If the audience that is scrutinizing your work is an organized crime organization, is a law enforcement organization, or is intelligence apparatus of a state, those entities have considerable resources. They have very sharp people working for them, and they can dig and poke and pull at every detail you give to analytically isolate who your sources are. And this is something that happened to the CIA's spy network in Iran and had cascade effects that essentially unwound the entire CIA informant network globally. But it basically began with a politician, I believe it was actually Barack Obama, who makes a reference to something that the United States knows about something happening in an Iranian nuclear facility. And Iran's counterintelligence folks perk up and say, oh, the United States knows about that, huh? Interesting. I wonder how many people could possibly have given the United States that information. And they just start whittling down. And they find that it's really a tiny handful of people who actually would have that level of specificity to be able to pass that information to the United States. And then they can start scrutinizing those people. And so that ability to analytically sort of disconnect, like there's a fact that's known, who could have that fact and drill down to that person allowed for Iran to identify the CIA informant and to turn that person as a double agent to get access to the CIA's global communication system that was used for running sources. And the CIA and Iran figured out how to identify that system and then began hunting down informants globally. So again, if you're just sort of throwing something out there for the general public and you want deniability about who's the school board member of a small town, it's probably fine to just do composites and pseudonyms. But if the topic that you're interested in is something that is going to receive scrutiny from major organizations with resources, I would strongly encourage people to think about every single detail that they are putting out there as a potential avenue back to a source. Okay, so I've been hammering on anonymity because it's really important, and if you are studying something potentially volatile, you don't want to have that go wrong. But there are other scientific values that we have this beyond just we protect our informants and provide them anonymity. Science also rests on the idea of transparency. Science also rests on the idea of replicability. I posed a semi-provocative question of, is qualitative research scientific? And I was sort of pointing at these sort of things and saying qualitative research oftentimes struggles to make the case that it's transparent because data is kept oftentimes private. It's oftentimes difficult to have replicability because the experiences I had in the field or the interviews that I had were kind of one-off things. And there was that reflexivity problem of it was something that happened because I was there. And you could sit down and interview the same person and they might not give you the same story. It may not play out the same way. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I did something wrong or that you did something wrong. It's just a recognition of qualitative data is sort of immersed in human interactions. And those are difficult to replicate with exactness. And this is something that Andrew I'm struggling with his last name, Moravsik, sorry, apologize, Andrew, highlighted in sort of a critique of qualitative research. And he said transparency is precondition for scholars to have their contributions recognized and rewarded. And for that to happen, scholarly conversations we have to have a reason to trust what others are saying, which rests on expectation of sufficient openness and honesty and evidence, arguments and research design at the level of the discursive playing field. We all have to be able to see what everybody else is doing to know if you're doing something shady or if you're doing something rigorous. And that's the problem that he posed. And the solution that he offered is this thing called Annotation for Transparency Initiative, in which qualitative information, whether it's interviews or fieldwork notes or even archival stuff, could be uploaded to a system, an online system that would generate unique links, URLs, that could be associated with each snippet of information. And each snippet of information in and of itself could be anonymized, but collectively the whole of the qualitative research would be available and could be easily inserted into the paper, right? So, and this goes back to the mechanics question, right? How do you report it? And that initial reporting that the American Psychological Association offers us doesn't really give me any way to verify that that's a real thing that happened, that's real information. Whereas now you can include that link to this online portal and people can go there and read for themselves what you were basing that on. And so in talking about sort of what's good about this, right, maybe that avoids the need for these long block quotes that sometimes we use, or long discursive footnotes in which you describe in detail, aspects of fieldwork. You can just sort of say, as referenced here, boom, link. If people are curious, they can go. And that maybe allows for qualitative research to be presented in maybe more article form instead of book form. You can maybe get around that thick description by giving people the option of going and getting the description if they want it. It's also nice from a scientific perspective that the raw qualitative data is available for others to scrutinize and use potentially. That is oftentimes a scientific value that we can go and look at what each other are doing and figure out if it's sketchy or rigorous. But it does raise questions about anonymity. And I think this is one of the things that qualitative researchers have really screamed bloody murder about, that this approach of expecting that qualitative information will be posted online, that puts us in a real bind when we're thinking about how to ensure external anonymity for sources. Yeah. The other thing I would flag, and I don't know that we've necessarily had this conversation because I think it cuts to the heart of something that I think the scientific community doesn't like to really wrestle with and acknowledge. And that is that the whole enterprise rests on the professional ethics of researchers, that we don't lie, that we don't fabricate things. And that's not always true. There are cases where people do engage in overt fabrication of data. This system doesn't actually stop that, right? Posting field notes to a website so that other people can read your field notes requires writing up field notes. But if I was going to lie and tell you that I had done field work and had this experience and talk about that in a paper, that I took my lie one step further and wrote up field notes to support that lie, and then uploaded those field notes to the web so that other people could read my lie in greater, richer detail, doesn't necessarily stop me from lying. It maybe makes the job harder for me, but if I do it well, it also makes my lie more credible because I have these field notes that people are scrutinizing, and I wouldn't have put them out there unless I was, above board. And so I'm not convinced that this really stops the lying problem. But it does maybe help with the sense of confidence that we have in what each other are doing. That if I assume that you are above board and that this is real information that you're presenting, at least I can maybe understand the way that you wrestled with it, and that we're not playing sort of a social scientist game of telephone in which you tell me something and then I hear something slightly different and I repeat it in a slightly different way. We can always go back to the original source and confirm that the story is sort of staying more or less stable over time. And there's value in that. And so I think this is out there. It's being discussed by social scientists. I don't think we've reached a consensus on it, but it's worth understanding where that conversation is coming from.